Once upon a time, Disney was a company that made everybody's favorite childhood animated movies. They would dip their toes into live action with celebrated classics like High School Musical, Camp Rock, and Halloweentown, but these were all mostly made-for-TV movies. Disney had a lane with the mouse and his friends, and a bunch of classics that now come with warnings when you try to watch them on Disney+. But they also had this other, very out-of-pocket for the time franchise with Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, you have to remember, this was long before Disney had bought their way into a monopoly with franchises like Marvel and Star Wars, so Pirates of the Caribbean was their only major live-action success, with a string of other, not-so-successful live-action ventures. And seeing as how most major franchises today have tried becoming a skin of whatever recent Marvel project that did well recently, Pirates of the Caribbean stands out quite a bit nowadays. It had humor, action, magical elements, audience applause moments that weren't so in your face, and overall provided something different from the usual action, adventure, fantasy movies of the 2000s. But looking back at this franchise now, with how publicly it's been used and mocked thanks to Johnny Depp's trial, and how uncertain its future is, I figured now was a good time to look back at this franchise and point out its greatness, its flaws, and everything in between. As it stands right now, this is a franchise that slowly but surely got worse with each passing movie. At least that's what all the ratings say. So is there any truth to that?
Yeah, and no lies.
Is this franchise a mess with only one real good movie? Or is it far more underrated than people claim? So grab your rum, come aboard the Black Pearl, and let's talk everything and anything about Pirates of the Caribbean. The Curse of the Black Pearl is basically universally agreed to be the best movie in this franchise, but why is that? I believe there's a number of reasons. Some of those have to do with the writing of this story and basic storytelling principles, but let's not leave out the most obvious reason here. It's pirates. Pirates were really the one fantasy-esque aspect of the early 2000s that was missing. We had superheroes, classic sword and shield fantasy, wizards, but pirates was entirely unique. I think that Disney realized this and took a huge risk by making a live-action movie based off of one of their theme park rides. Clearly this found success, so Disney has continued to do that.
I do that quite a lot. People are always surprised.
In recent years with movies like The Haunted Mansion and Jungle Cruise, although those were met with much less success for a variety of different reasons. The opening minutes of this movie sets up each three of our central characters and the world around them incredibly well. We first meet Elizabeth and Will, getting to know Elizabeth as the governor's daughter and a, strange suitor for Commodore Norrington. But we also meet Will, who grows up to be the blacksmith's apprentice, and we see that both he and Elizabeth have continued a friendship over the years. There's also subtle hints towards their characters, like how Will says he'll give the compliments to the maker of the sword, even though clearly he's the one who made it. But of course, our final character introduction to cap off the big three is
Captain Jack Sparrow, if you please.
Captain Jack Sparrow. There's nothing I can say about Johnny Depp's performance as Jack Sparrow that hasn't already been said. He's up there with the most irreplaceable roles ever, all of his dialogue is witty, his character entirely unique and likable, and the way he delivers his lines is impeccable. The entire character of Jack Sparrow is all about two things: unpredictability and luck. This movie shows that incredibly well, and this series continues to show that until it doesn't. Each of these three characters have distinct personalities and motivations behind the things that they do, but there's one thing that a lot of people get wrong when it comes to this movie, and this series in general, and that's the fact that Jack Sparrow...
You forgot one very important thing, mate. I'm Captain Jack Sparrow.
Captain Jack Sparrow is not the main character. The main character, at least in this movie, is Will Turner. This film follows the same formula as all other hero's journey films and stories before it. The first Harry Potter, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, this is no different when you look at it that way, but the main character is actually Will Turner, and Jack Sparrow fills the role of the mentor. That's where this film feels entirely unique among other heroes' journey stories, because Jack is very unlike any other mentor in these other films. Very quickly, we're introduced to the story of this movie with the Aztec coin around Will's necklace in the beginning, and Jack recognizing that coin when he saves Elizabeth's life. This gives the story this intriguing and ominous vibe, especially when the Black Pearl comes to attack Port Royal. To that point in the movie, everything had been more or less realistic, and I say more or less because these movies are not at all realistic, but we hadn't seen anything too supernatural. The action and the set pieces are all ridiculously silly. None of this works the way it should, and they lean into that every way they can. Jack getting away from imprisonment, and then Jack and Will's fight are both excellent scenes and a lot of fun to watch unfold, but they are in no way realistic. It's scenes like this that are entwined in the series' DNA, and they truly only get more and more ridiculous from here on out, so if you can't sustain your disbelief for things like this, then I've got news for you. Pirates of the Caribbean really isn't for you. One of the best things about this movie is how greatly paced it is. I am never bored watching this movie. It has such a great flow to the story because you're always laughing at Jack, captivated by some sort of set piece, or invested in watching the mystery unfold. It also sets up more in this universe with the mention of Bootstrap and Jack talking about how he knew him. This, of course, comes right after the scene of Jack and Will switching boats after the one chasing them is ready to set sail, which is really just a great plan and scene and proves that Captain Jack Sparrow really is
the best pirate I've ever seen. So it would seem.
The effects of this movie have not aged very gracefully. The CGI skeletons just don't really do it for me, but these are older movies. I just hope the effects in the next ones get better. One thing this movie and all of these movies do well is show pirates as they are. They don't have a ton of loyalty, they look out for themselves and try to do what's best for them. Jack is the mentor to Will, but they constantly fight and he only really looks out for Will when it helps him. It may seem different because of the events of this film, but as the franchise goes on, that becomes increasingly more clear. There really isn't any heroes or villains in this franchise, which is perfect when you're talking about pirates. We have characters that we like and want to root for, and we have characters that we don't like and want to see fail, but all of the villains are still just trying to do what they think is best. On the topic of technical villains, let's talk about Captain Barbossa, who is one of my absolute favorite characters of all time. He makes for a really great villain in this movie, but again, he's really just a technical villain. All he wants to do is stop the curse for him and his crew. He's not particularly evil, he can be menacing, sure, but he doesn't just want to watch others suffer for enjoyment or anything like that.
That's it?
Waste not.
Which is far different when you compare him to villains in the future of this franchise. The pirate ship battle is one of my favorite scenes in all of cinema. There's excellent stakes between the characters we want to root for and the characters we want to see fail, and the world building of the characters explaining the ships and how quick they are is great setup, and just the absolute chaos that ensues is great. While a lot of battles in this series are ridiculous, this one actually feels pretty grounded and realistic, and it's definitely, in my opinion, the best pirate ship battle ever put to screen. But then again, I don't really watch a ton of pirate stuff. Regardless, this scene is great. This movie really pushes the PG-13 rating, especially in the third act. The sword fighting between Jack and Barbossa is great and fun to watch, but it's also incredibly pointless, especially when both of them are cursed and they can't actually kill each other. But the big three working together and Jack finally getting his shot is such great writing and such a satisfying end to Captain Barbossa. The ending with them saving Jack is also great fun, but the Commodore letting him go is ridiculous. He's been fighting with Jack Sparrow this whole movie. He got dumped by the girl he was going after, but somehow he just is above all that now. It's a very Disney movie ending in an otherwise not so Disney movie, if you get what I mean. So this movie, for me, is one of my all-time favorite movies. This is the Pirates movie that I'll rewatch whenever I want to watch one of these, and given as how the structure of this movie is very simple with its hero's journey formula, it makes for a pretty solid script, but the character of Jack Sparrow and the pirate nature of this film really elevates it above most other hero's journey stories. This movie is a 10 out of 10, not even scaled with the ranking of this franchise. I just genuinely find this to be like a perfect or near perfect movie. Also, the music in this movie and this franchise is like top 5 movie soundtrack ever. I didn't know where to fit that in with this review, so on to the next one. With how much of a success the first movie was, Disney knew they had a huge potential franchise in their hands, which led to some strange decisions when it came to the making of these next 2 films. This movie and At World's End were shot back-to-back, similar to what another previous hugely successful movie trilogy did with Lord of the Rings, which must have been very strange for Orlando Bloom to do this again. I talked about how Disney-fied the ending of the last movie was, with Norrington just letting Jack go, so I actually like that this movie opens up with some major repercussions for the decisions made at the end of the last movie. During the whole setup phase in the first act, a lot of the scenes just seem to be moving from one to another with no real pace or reason for them. Almost like a lot of the scenes could be interchangeable or just re-edited altogether, and honestly, a lot of this movie just kind of feels that way. And there's a very specific reason for that, because even though this movie was given a few years of pre-production, it was being developed at the same time as the next movie. And with these 2 movies being much bigger productions and having a ton of different moving parts to them, what they did was write out the bigger sequences and the events that needed to happen, but had the writers on set during the days where they needed to film all the in-between sequences. And this really feels this way when you watch these 2 movies. There's some absolutely incredible action sequences and story elements, but sometimes the in-between phases of the story feel disconnected to downright sloppy. The Island of Cannibals is the first sequence in the film that feels fully realized. This was clearly one of the big ideas in this film, and the whole first half hour or so was basically about how they could get these characters to that island. In a lot of ways, I almost feel like this is what the movie should have opened up on, because a lot of the timeline in this movie, or in the beginning portion of the movie, doesn't really make sense with how it's edited. All of the scenes in the beginning can't be happening at the same time, because when Will arrives to the island, the Pearl and all the crew must have been there for quite some time. All of Jack's scenes before the island really aren't that necessary either. He could just tell Will that if he wants the compass, he'll need to help him find the key, which is exactly what he does anyway. Having the initial scene of him coming to the Pearl with the drawing of the key, sure, it makes for a humorous moment, but it's really not needed. Like I mentioned in the last movie, part of Pirates of the Caribbean is just kinda accepting some of the more ridiculous events and sequences, but some of the stuff that happens on this island is almost too unrealistic, even by Pirates of the Caribbean standards. While some of the moment-to-moment stuff isn't the strongest, the actual overarching plot is very strong. Each side has different motivations, whether it be for something intangible like Will trying to free Elizabeth, or something tangible like Jack needing the key or Cutter needing the compass. And with the plot being really solid on paper and actually well thought out, this makes for some really great misdirection and foreshadowing to future events. Like when they first go to Tia Dalma's and we see that she has this necklace, they hear the story of Davy Jones and how he fell in love with a woman, and they even see Jack the Monkey in the corner with a pair of boots leading to some person. I wonder who that could be. By the time we actually meet Davy Jones, we're like an hour into the movie and it still feels like we're in the first act. But speaking of Davy Jones, let's talk about one of the greatest and honestly underrated movie villains of all time. I think a lot of people used to rank him very high, but either time or memory has dropped his ranking. Whatever it is, Davy Jones is incredibly menacing, but also strangely charming, and Bill Nighy as Davy Jones is an all-time great casting. I mentioned that the last movie didn't really hold up by today's CGI standards, and of course, the CGI for Davy Jones and his crew are still, to this day, top-notch. I'm I'm not too sure what this says about this movie or movies today, but once upon a time, Disney highly prioritized the visual effects and overall quality of the movie. In this case, they might have prioritized that a bit more over the writing, but the result is a movie that still holds up to this day, and a movie that was the highest grossing movie in 2006. This is kind of another side tangent here, but there are just way too many blockbuster movies nowadays. With Marvel and every other company trying to do like 4 or 5 blockbusters a year, it's no wonder why studios are losing money. This movie was an event, just like how every Star Wars or Harry Potter movie was an event. Ant-Man 3 is not an event. You cannot convince me to go and see a movie in theaters that you made in less than a year and will be on streaming in 2 weeks. Anyways, the whole sequence at Tortuga, where we meet Norrington and Elizabeth reunites with the crew, is another sequence that feels fully realized. As does the dice scene with Will, Bootstrap, and Davy Jones, and of course the Kraken destroying the ship that Will's on because he stole the key. Basically, after that hour to hour and a half mark in the movie, this film really hits its stride, the sequences really ramp up, and the ideas that they had trouble setting up coherently in the first half all start coming together, and overall, I just think that the second half is really great. And speaking of the Kraken scene, for one, they achieved the horror of this creature being essentially unstoppable, and Hans Zimmer, as always, absolutely cooked with this soundtrack. And as the movie just continually gets better, it leads us to the third act, where all the storylines converge on the island to get the dead man's chest. While I think the first movie is absolutely perfect or near perfect, I think that the third act of this movie is the best Pirates of the Caribbean we've ever seen, and it really never meets this expectation ever again. This is just the epitome of what this franchise is. Everybody fighting for their own individual goals, maybe working together sometimes if it benefits them, but when it comes down to it, everybody's really in it for their own gain. Pair that with some crazy, physics-breaking stunts like the fight on the wheel, and you have an incredibly memorable, unique, and exciting sequence. All of the writing plants and misdirect from earlier all come to a head here. It's funny, it's thrilling, it's entertaining, it all clicks together like one great giant puzzle. This is easily the best scene in the movie, and in my opinion, it's the best scene in the entire franchise. This movie, like most second entries in trilogies, offers the low point of the series. Jack is dead, Norrington is the one who got the heart, the Black Pearl is gone, Will and Elizabeth aren't on good terms, but with Davy Jones being alive and of course Barbossa returning, there's still work to be done. I remember not liking this movie as a kid, mostly because Jack died, but with an older perspective, I think that this is one of the greatest endings and the only ending that would have really worked for this movie. There's a lot of good things in this movie, but there's also a lot of things that bring this movie down. I believe that there's a version of this movie in the editing room that is far better and makes this movie on par or better than Curse of the Black Pearl. Ultimately, what we got is not that movie, but again, there's a lot to love here, so I'm going 8.5 out of 10. Once again, this movie starts off on a pretty dark note for a PG-13 movie, and especially a Disney movie. The opening 30 minutes or so of this movie actually feels a lot more focused than the last movie did. Partly because there's a very clear and obvious path forward that was laid out at the end of the last movie, but even in this we're introduced to the concept of the pirate lords and how the age of pirates is coming to an end because of the East India Trading Company, and how there's some new alliances being made. There's a bunch of new stuff in here, but this mission feels entirely more focused than the opening of the last movie. That being said, there has always been something a bit off about this whole storyline. That being, why do all of these people actually want Jack Sparrow back? Sure, Jack sacrificed himself at the end for them, but it's a pirate's life for me. The first movie says very clearly that they will absolutely leave people behind. I understand that Jack and all of these characters have gone through character development, Elizabeth has regrets for her actions, but the movie even realizes this by adding in that Jack is apparently one of the pirate lords, and that's the motivation for Barbossa trying to get him back, but even this has just always felt a bit shallow to me. During their mission to get Jack back, Will and Elizabeth have a bunch of problems that could very easily be solved if they just talk to one another, so the whole not talking thing feels a bit forced to me. On paper, it works because it's supposed to show them becoming more and more like pirates, keeping their own motivations and actions close to their chest, but it just comes across as if these two characters are really stupid now. The whole reintroduction to Jack Sparrow scene quite literally makes me think I've been taking substances that are illegal because of how absolutely batshit weird and insane it is. But if this is the mind of Jack Sparrow, some prisoner at the end of the world, then I suppose this is exactly what I would picture Jack's mind to be like. I also like seeing how Davy Jones' locker is a physical place, but I will say I don't particularly even understand how they can go there and then come back. I know you can kind of just chalk it up to magic, but this whole universe and story has always had magical elements at play, but this movie and the whole up is down aspect seems to make very little sense to me. Even in a world with skeleton curses and ships with tentacle monsters in charge of them, this whole aspect just doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. I also think it's kind of dumb that the Kraken is just dead, with no explanation given whatsoever. Which leads me to one of my next big issues with the movie, and how this movie is horrible at revealing things. The actual reveal that Tia Dalma is Davy Jones' lover is very underwhelming. All of the elements of foreshadowing just come with these expositional dumps that make it either very obvious where the story is going, or just make so little sense if you haven't already seen the movie. That might sound like a contradiction, but the reveals are all very black and white. The movie either tells you exactly what's going on, or it just never does and expects you to just kind of be okay with the things happening. Whenever I watch this movie, it kind of feels like I'm watching it for the first time, mostly because I don't really watch this one all that often, at least not as much as I watched the first two, and I always kind of forget what happens in this movie until it starts happening, and then I remember a bit of the plot. But at one point, I used to call this movie the most confusing movie of all time, because there's so much that happens in this movie, and there's so many concepts that are introduced and built upon. It's honestly really easy to get lost if you aren't paying close attention to all the exposition conversations that the characters have. Part of all this confusion comes from how allegiances change so quickly in this movie. I give this series credit for staying true to pirates and always looking out for themselves, but this movie really goes overboard with that concept. Will Turner, in particular, changes his allegiances and sides in basically every scene that he's in. I think this is to show him becoming more like Jack and more like a pirate and how unpredictable he is, but at any point in the movie, Will could be against his friends, fighting for his father, fighting for Elizabeth, trying to get his old life back, trying to find Gimli, any number of things to the point that it's really just not worth following along until you just wait and see where he is at the end. Nothing illustrates the whole pirate's mindset better than when the 6 people are standing on the island for a parley. Each of these people are fighting for their own reasons, they have their own motivations, they keep betraying and backstabbing one another, even when they're trying to be allies. It's very uneasy, and keeping track of all of this is partly why this movie is so confusing. This is really an indication of the movie's biggest misstep, and that's the fact that this movie suffers a lot from having absolutely terrible pacing. Scenes just kind of happen, one after another, with no real flow or connection. Things that I feel like we should see, we don't, and stuff that I feel like doesn't have to be happening goes on for like 10 minutes. It feels like this movie just has moments to it, but no real structure. I used to think that Tia Dalma being Calypso was really dumb. Now I understand that when she was introduced, this was kind of always the plan for her character. So now I just think the whole idea of Calypso itself is really stupid. It's really just here to explain more about how Jack was so important. They needed Pirate Lord Jack Sparrow to get back so that way they could get all 9 pieces of 8, which is a phrase that makes absolutely no sense, by the way, so they could release Calypso so she could cause a storm during the final battle. But honestly, a lot of the Calypso stuff just seems really tacked on. Even the way it's introduced in this movie, with Barbossa just casually announcing that they have this ancient god on board with them, feels so out of left field. The entire Calypso plotline is also the reason why this movie is way longer than it needs to be. There's truly not a whole lot that actually happens in this movie when you think about it. They go and get Jack back, the pirates all meet and elect Elizabeth the king, then they go and fight Davy Jones. These are like the big 3 sequences in the movie, and the rest of the movie is just a bunch of poorly paced scenes filled with a ton of unnecessary exposition about the world. Sure, the final act is a really great spectacle and it's a lot of fun to watch, but I think a lot of this movie could be edited down and this final act would still have the same emotional effect. I do like the ending and how bittersweet it is. The whole movie sets up how Jack could take over Davy Jones's place, and that would, in a lot of ways, be a much better ending, but Will taking it over because he's forced to is more tragic and kind of solidifies how the pirate life really is for him. It also shows how much Jack actually transformed, and when the time was right, he actually did make the unselfish decision. I also like how it's the sword that Will made that ends up stabbing him. I love small things like this. The symbolism there is so great. His old life is gone, and now he's forced to live out a completely new one. I also love that we get this final climactic showdown between Davy Jones and Jack Sparrow. That's what the people want to see, and in an age where fantasy is so concerned with going against the grain and trying to subvert expectations, it's cool to have moments where the main hero and the main villain just fight. Every time I watch this movie, I think I'm gonna like it much better than I actually do. And sometimes that does happen. Sometimes I watch this movie and I'm like, okay, I feel like I understand why people hold this as the ending of the trilogy in such high esteem. But other times, I just think this movie is a complete and utter mess. This is not a bad movie. The performances are great, the writing is pretty solid, the effects and music are phenomenal. The story itself just isn't that good. If you're a fan of this movie, then unfortunately for you, during the making of this video and rewatching this movie, it's one of those times where I was just really disappointed with it. So overall, I'm going to give this movie like a 6 out of 10. Usually, when you have a franchise that loses 2/3 of its leading stars, you're kind of screwed, and honestly, not having Will and Elizabeth being in this movie vastly lowers expectations. This movie seems like a cash grab in all sense of the word, but honestly, I don't think it is. Now, I believe I saw this movie in theaters and then either didn't like it or just didn't remember it, and I know how much the internet says this movie is bad, so I didn't watch this movie for like years on years, up until like 2 or 3 years ago, and since then I've actually rewatched this movie a few more times. Why? Because this is actually a really solid movie. This is the first time in the series that Jack Sparrow is the actual main character. Sure, he's been the highlight of the previous films, but it was always both Will and Elizabeth going on their journeys. Jack actually changes very little from beginning to end, so this movie gave us the opportunity to finally see Captain Jack as the front and center character, unapologetically so. This meant that they had to keep true to the character that we know and love, but also expand his personality and antics. And it meant prioritizing his 2 primary qualities, and that's, again, being lucky and unpredictable. We see this time and time again in the trilogy, but because he wasn't the main character, this whole how he did these things is not highlighted. The beginning portion of the film in London perfectly demonstrates how different this point of view will be with Jack as the main character as opposed to when he was the mentor character. We see more of Jack's thoughts and plans to escape, like when he puts the napkin on the precise spot on the floor, and how he uses the chandelier to cross over to the balcony. It's like we're in on Jack's thoughts now, and while some people might think this takes away from the character, I actually like seeing this perspective because it still stays true to his core 2 elements. Sure, we get a bigger heads up that he's planning something, we just don't know exactly what that something is. On Stranger Tides is a much more streamlined film than the previous 2 movies. And in that way, it actually kind of reminds me of the first movie a little bit. The previous 2 movies had so many different storylines to check in on and follow, and of course, with the different allegiances changing all the time, you really had to pay attention to whatever was going on. This film mainly follows Jack's point of view for like the entire time. There's a few other times where we see some other characters like Barbossa and Gibbs, and it's from their point of view, but it's still much more streamlined and paced very well. Now, I say this movie reminds me of the first one in the way that it's paced, but there's still some issues from the second and third movies that continued in this one. There's still the exposition dumps that come with zero context, like Jack's encounter/vision with his father, who tells him that he needs the 2 chalices, and then there's Angelica saying that there's a prophecy that Blackbeard will be killed by a one-legged man. And wow, it just so happens that Barbossa now only has 1 leg. But where did this prophecy come from? Who spoke it? This is some of the stuff that plagued this franchise in general. Stuff just kind of happens and you just have to accept it as fact, which is kind of hard to do because this is a franchise with pirates, who aren't exactly trustworthy folks. One of my favorite scenes in this movie is the entire mermaid sequence. I think this scene perfectly captures the horror and beauty of the folktale mermaids, and the theme song that they have is equally as haunting. If anything, Pirates of the Caribbean just confirms my fear of the sea and oceans with all these krakens and mermaids. I'm not too sure why all these people are always so eager to get out at sea, because this is terrifying. As the storylines converge, it makes Jack and Barbossa these unlikely allies who team up to get the chalices, and this is the type of stuff that made the first movie so good. Unlikely alliances that can be easily broken due to personal motivation. But there's a respect between them, and if there's any loyalty in pirates, it's respect. These are 2 captains of the Black Pearl, and if there's one thing that they share at all, it's the love for that boat. I love how all the different teams come together in the final act, and how the Spanish were actually there to destroy the Fountain of Youth, not use it for themselves. The mermaid coming to give the chalices back to Jack makes the story connect a bit more, but also doesn't make much sense as to why she would do that. She didn't owe any sort of allegiance to Jack or Angelica. She only really ever interacted positively with Philip, so I'm not too sure why she did this. I feel like there's a motivation missing there, but if it was there, then this would be a really solid ending to her story. I also kept thinking this whole movie that Geoffrey Rush looked much older, but at the end, when he's actually in Barbossa's getup, he looks fine. Ian McShane as Blackbeard is a okay villain. He's always a great actor, and Blackbeard had some menacing moments, but overall just definitely not as good as Barbossa or Davy Jones. So I'm gonna be honest and say that I actually really like this movie. Is it perfect? No, absolutely not, but I like what this movie borrows from the first one and not the second or third ones. This felt like a much cleaner script. I didn't particularly miss Will or Elizabeth all that much because the story didn't really call for them to be in it. The new characters were all fine and did their job, and overall, I think this is definitely a pretty underrated movie. I'm gonna go 7.5 out of 10. So with how underrated I feel the last movie is, I was hoping that trend would continue when I watched this movie. I do actually remember seeing this one in theaters and being incredibly disappointed. This is also the movie that got a lot of buzz around it because of the famous Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial.
The screenplay that I received was not up to snuff, I felt.
But there was a lot of hype surrounding this movie when it first came out because Will Turner and Elizabeth Swann were back. They were everywhere in the trailers, and we all thought that we were going to be in for another classic Pirates adventure, with the possibility of handing it down to the next generation with Will and Elizabeth's son. Well, as it turns out, Will is in this movie for about 5 minutes, and Elizabeth is in it for maybe 30 seconds. Now, I don't have any issue with small cameos for some nostalgia bait, but when the movie was marketed with the fact that Will and Elizabeth were back, you kind of figure they're going to have a much bigger role than they actually did.
What a truly revolting sight.
So this movie follows a bunch of ghost pirates going after Jack Sparrow, and his only hope of stopping them and helping out Will's son is to go and get the Trident of Poseidon, which is weird that this supposedly has the power to break Will's curse on the Dutchman, and Davy Jones didn't think of this a long time ago. So let's talk about the biggest misstep in this movie, and that's Jack Sparrow himself. This movie completely loses both his luck and cleverness and unpredictability traits and turns him into a bumbling, drunken fool. Captain Jack was always drunken, but he was never a fool. He's no longer clever in the way he goes about his business, his lines are far less witty or remarkable as they once were, and his luck has far less to do with him being ahead of the situation surrounding him, and more so to do with stuff just kinda happening to him. Now, part of this movie and Jack's character arc is that he's no longer the man he once was. He's no longer the cunning pirate that's worth following, and on paper, this doesn't sound too bad. On paper, this never sounds too bad, but when it's executed time and time again, it's very clear that audiences don't want to see this kind of character arc in a movie.
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man? Get your ass on.
This movie also just completely disregards events from the previous films, like how apparently Jack got the compass fighting Captain Salazar when he was younger, but in Dead Man's Chest, it was said that Tia Dalma is the one who gave Jack the compass, so is this some sort of roundabout way of saying that it was actually Calypso who gave him the compass? Or did the writers just forget that they had already explained this and went with something else? I know which one I'm leaning towards, but you be the judge. Similar to the last movie with Ian McShane, but to a worse degree here, this movie absolutely wastes Javier Bardem as the movie's villain. They also basically just make these ghosts have the same sort of rules to them as Davy Jones and his men, which makes me think that maybe in a first draft of the script, this actually was Davy Jones. I mean, there is a post-credit scene teasing his return, although given as how it's been 7 years since this movie with no promise in the future, I'm not too sure how likely his return actually is anymore. While it's cool that a lot of the supporting characters from the trilogy came back for this one, they really don't do anything worthwhile, and all the new characters don't really capture my attention the way that they should. These two characters are clearly just replacement Will and Elizabeth, whether it's because it's intended to be that way, or if this was at one point actually supposed to be Will and Elizabeth, I'm not too sure, but these two are basically caricatures of the older characters, and that just feels unnecessary. The last movie had a story that worked without Will and Elizabeth, but now this one just feels like it's trying far too hard to incorporate them, both physically and spiritually. I don't even really find the third act and the actual finding of Poseidon's trident all that great, but I will say that Barbossa's sacrifice is a pretty great scene and it's very emotional because of who Barbossa is and how long we've known and cared for him. But I mean, if he didn't have the legacy he has and this was just the one movie that he was in, it really wouldn't hold too much weight. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think this is far and away the worst Pirates movie. I happen to agree with Johnny's take on this.
The screenplay was very lazily written, and I had to do a lot of rewriting.
This movie could have been really great with the whole plot of getting Will and Elizabeth back together and breaking Will's curse, setting up a whole new crew to take adventures with, but again, stuff like this barely works. So I'm gonna give this movie like a 5.5 out of 10. So my overall ranking of these movies is pretty simple. Since there's only 5 movies, let's just put them in descending order. Number 1 is, of course, The Curse of the Black Pearl. I think this is a near-perfect movie. It's a hero's journey story with a pirate skin on it, and it takes full advantage of the setting and of pirates in general. And this is just personally like a top 10 favorite movie of mine, so yeah, number 1. Next up is Dead Man's Chest. I think that after a rocky first hour or so, the movie really hits its stride and the set pieces are really well done, all thought out and written to perfection, and they're just fun to watch. The final act and ending to this movie are like the greatest 30 minutes of Pirates of the Caribbean in general, so it's gotta come in second. Next up is controversial pick here, but it's On Stranger Tides. I think this is a very solid movie all around. I think the plot is much more coherent and straightforward than the previous 2 movies of the franchise. I like how it's basically about 3 groups of people trying to find something, and then I like how Jack Sparrow is the main character and how that feels different from the trilogy before it. And overall, yeah, it's just really underrated movie. Next up is Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. Listen, I know a lot of people like this movie, and every time I boot it up, I think that maybe this is the time I'm gonna get it, and I'll see what everybody else sees, but I just never do. This movie is all over the place with its plot, it's way longer than it needs to be, and although it starts off pretty good and has a pretty great final act, all of the stuff in the middle seems really unfocused, unnecessary, and sometimes just downright confusing. And last, and certainly least, is Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Men Tell No Tales. I talked earlier about how these movies have a pretty unique identity among major blockbuster franchises, but this one is just missing whatever that secret sauce was that all the other ones had. This was in a post-Disney, Star Wars, and Marvel era, and that definitely shows, because this feels like the Ant-Man 3 of Pirates of the Caribbean movies. It's not worth your time, it's not worth my time, don't watch this movie. And that is all of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So far. There's long been a rumored Pirates movie starring Margot Robbie in the works, but it would be more of a reboot rather than a direct sequel. Johnny Depp is, barring anything absolutely major, not returning as Captain Jack Sparrow. He's made that very clear over the years that he doesn't want anything to do with Disney anymore, but I think even Disney knows that any further Pirates movie without Jack Sparrow...
Captain Jack Sparrow.
Captain Jack Sparrow and Johnny Depp as Captain Jack Sparrow probably isn't gonna land all that well with the majority of audiences. There hasn't been an update on this 6th movie in quite some time, so who knows if it will ever actually come out. This has been an extremely successful franchise for Disney monetarily, so they know they want to continue it, but right now it just seems like everybody involved is stuck between a rock and a hard place. As a franchise overall, Pirates of the Caribbean is incredibly strange. It has, in my opinion, a top 10 movie ever made, but then everything after that, for a lot of people, is really hit or miss. There's of course the diehard fans who love all the movies, who would take another Pirates movie with or without Johnny Depp, but regardless of that, with a 6th movie, they would need something to recapture that magic that at least the first 3 movies had. Overall, I do think that this is a franchise that got a little bit worse with each entry. Even though I like the 4th movie better than the 3rd, there's still some noticeable downgrades in the budget and the overall care of the movie. The 5th movie didn't exactly meet the expectations that Disney wanted it to, or the expectations that most fans wanted out of it, so who knows, maybe this long break in between movies will be exactly what Pirates needed, or this rumored 6th movie could turn out to be a huge disaster that completely erases any and all hope in the future. So that's Pirates of the Caribbean. Let me know your thoughts on this franchise in the comments below and which movie is your favorite. If you want to see more videos like this, like say, a Lord of the Rings video, make sure to hit that like button, and if we can get to 1,000 likes in the first week that this video is posted, I'll have that Lord of the Rings video coming out very soon. Special thanks to all my channel members, and I will see you all in the next one.
Yeah.